Mine. That's what the Red Keep is. The small folk say its color comes from the blood Aegon spilled to win his crown. Fools. Blood doesn't soak into stone, no matter how hard I try. Aegon built his castle of red rock to remind people of the fires he'd roasted his enemies in, so whenever King's Landing looked up, they'd see the price of defiance. He knew the first rule of kings. Only fear keeps men in line. Fear and punishment. A lesson he taught his son, Maegor. When the builders finally finished the Red Keep, Maegor executed them all to keep its secrets safe. Rumor has it, miles of hidden passageways run behind the walls and under the floors. One day I'll have to find them. Traitors and women work in shadows. A king has no need for secrecy. Now, people name Maegor the Cruel, but I doubt any dared in his day. His strength was all too rare in the degenerate Targaryen blood. The simpering Baelor the Blessed created the Maiden Vault to imprison his own sisters and save himself from carnal thoughts. Disgusting. Though, I admit a Prince Vault could be amusing when Tommen bores me. My favorite place in the Red Keep? There's so many. The Traitor's Walk, where I mount the heads of my enemies. It's a shame flesh rots so slowly. I've almost run out of spikes. The dungeons are also quite nice once you get past the first 2 levels. A stable for common criminals and private cells for useful highborns. How boring, I know. But then you come to the black cells. No windows, no torches, just darkness, and whatever you hear in there with you. Here we keep the greatest traitors, until the king is ready for them, and with these, I often like to take my time. But I've heard rumors of an even lower, hidden level, Maegor's favorite. Once a man was taken here, he never saw the sun again, nor heard a human voice, nor breathed a breath free of agonizing pain. Varys must know the way, but that overgrown girl pretends not to. Maybe he fears I'll make him a victim. Maybe I will. Then again, torture chambers are just so private. Better to punish your enemies where everyone can see and remember. Like that Targaryen who forced his nephew to watch as he fed the boy's traitor mother to a dragon. Oh, what I could do with a dragon. Even Aerys, fool as he was, knew to burn men alive with an audience, to spread the terror far and wide across his kingdoms. Of course, I know my favorite place now. When I sit on the Iron Throne, high in the Red Keep, all of Westeros scuttles below me, like insects, waiting for my heel to land.
East of Westeros lies the Smoking Sea, where no ship dares sail. There are those who swear it to be demon-haunted, and who's to say they're wrong? For it was there, thousands of years ago, that a cataclysmic event occurred, destroying one of the great civilizations in history. The precise details of their origins are lost to us, but it is said the Valyrians were once a modest community of shepherds, tending their flocks on a small peninsula of the great eastern continent. One fateful day, in a volcanic area known as the 14 Fires, they made a shattering discovery. Dragons. They were monstrous, scaled creatures with massive wings, sharp claws, and fiery breath. They were also said to have a deep-rooted connection to magic. In time, the Valyrians were able to tame the beasts. Harnessing their immense power, they established a city of wonder, unlike any before or since. They became skilled at sorcery and metallurgy, creating uncommon weapons of spell-forged steel. Wielding these weapons astride their dragons, the Valyrians conquered the surrounding lands and slowly expanded west. At the time, the Giscari Empire dominated much of the great eastern continent and tried to stop Valyria's expansion. The Giscari legions attacked the Valyrians 5 times, but could never defeat them. Finally, the Valyrians marched on their capital, Old Gis, and obliterated it, turning its streets and buildings to ash with dragon flame, and wiping the Giscari people and their culture off the face of the earth. The Freehold of Valyria, as it came to be known, became the most advanced civilization in the known world, with its own language, gods, and culture. The Valyrians' reach extended far and wide, covering most of the continent. Great cities were built and roadways paved, all of which led back to Valyria. The Freehold would prosper for nearly 5,000 years. But it was not to last. An event that became known only as the Doom laid waste to the Valyrians, their capital city, and its surrounding lands. The peninsula itself was shattered, becoming what is now the Smoking Sea. Every dragon was thought to be lost, as were the Valyrian spells, knowledge, and recorded history. Thus, the mighty empire collapsed. What caused this cataclysm? No one knows for certain. Some say it was a volcanic eruption. Others say the Valyrians' own sorcery got the better of them. In any event, the Doom's devastation of the Valyrian people was total, with the exception of a small rocky island in the narrow sea, Dragonstone. For it was there that the Targaryens, the last of old Valyria, dwelled. They would lie in wait for another 100 years before unleashing the fury of the dragon on another continent, Westeros.
At its height, the Valyrian Freehold ruled over half the known world. Not bad for former shepherds, but the Doom fell on them and sank their capital into the sea. Now Volantis is the ember of old Valyria, ensuring its flame does not go out from this world, as any Volantine will tell you. Pentoshi say the same about Pentos, Lycians about Lys, and so on. But after enough time in the 9 free cities, it's hard to see them as anything but ashes of glory. Volantis is the oldest, the first colony of Valyria. After the Doom, the Volantines tried to rebuild the empire under their rule. They failed. Not least because the last Valyrian with dragons, Aegon Targaryen, entered the war against them. Now they are content to dominate only their lower classes, or so they say. Braavos is the strangest, a city erected not by the Freehold, but against it. A labyrinth of illusion and deceit to hide the refugees from Valyria's slave lords. After the Doom, the city emerged from the shadows to become one of the greatest banking centers in the world. A man can get anything in Braavos, for a price. Especially death. Your own if you offend one of the swaggering swordsmen that pollute the city. Or, if you're very rich, or very desperate, anyone else's. Lys is the easiest of the free cities, full of pleasure houses catering to every taste, no matter how peculiar. Many men lose themselves in Lys and are never found, at least alive. When a man runs out of coin, the Lycians may grant him their other speciality on the house: poison. Pentos is the most ruthless. The Magisters make a great show of choosing the Prince of Pentos from the great families and granting him the powers of trade, justice, and war, as long as he checks with them first. On the new year, to bring good fortune to Pentos, this prince must deflower the Maid of the Field and the Maid of the Seas. I confess I don't know how each is chosen, or what becomes of them after serving their purpose. But if a crop should fail or a war be lost, the Magisters will slit the prince's throat and choose another. The other free cities are known for what they make. Mia has its lenses and finery, Norvos its axes, Quohor It's smiths who can reforge Valyrian steel. Tyrosh, its colors? I'm sure Lorath had something to the world, but I can't think of it. Frankly, the 9 of them are more alike than they would care to admit. They hire the same soldiers to fight the same wars for the same rulers, the rich, be they called magisters, archons, or what have you. When a Dothraki Khalasar approaches, they gift the same tribute to avoid the same sacking. For thousands of years, the disgraced of Westeros have drained east to pool in the free cities, where a man of honor counts for less than nothing, unless it raises his price. Better men than I have learned that what a man sells for gold, he can never buy back. He must earn it, by fire and blood.
On the shores of the God's Eye, due north of the Isle of Faces, rises a monument to arrogance and cruelty. Harrenhal. For a people who prided themselves on their ships, the Iron Men of old seized any chance to leave them, and carved out a vast kingdom from the peaceful river lords. The empire reached its zenith under King Harrenhal, called the Black by those he terrorized, and by his own men, though they meant it proudly. King Harren enslaved the Riverlands to raise the mightiest fortress Westeros had ever seen. A castle that could garrison 1 million men, with walls so vast that winters would come and go, and besieging armies grow old and grey before the castle fell. 5 towers he ordered, reaching into the heavens like grasping fingers. A monstrosity which he forced our people to build for their own subjugation. But the very day the slaves laid the last stone, Aegon Targaryen and his sisters arrived in the south. When they arrived with their small army, Harren laughed and shut the gates. Harrenhal would have its first test, and an easy one at that. It failed. Harrenhal could have withstood an assault from all the armies in Westeros combined. But Harren learned that the tallest and thickest walls meant little to dragons, for dragons fly. With Harren and his sons dead, Harrenhal quickly surrendered to Aegon. House Tully then raised the River Lords in rebellion against the Iron Islands, and with Aegon we flushed the Iron Men to the sea. We should have torn down the castle stone by stone then, but Harrenhal seemed such a magnificent prize that Aegon gave it to one of his commanders, whose line then withered to extinction, as would every family to hold it thereafter. When many speak of Harrenhal, their voices drop to whispers about Mad Lady Lothson, who was said to send a giant bat to collect children for her crockpots, and to bathe in blood and serve feasts of human flesh. About the ghosts of Black Harren and his sons who still walk the castle at night, all aflame. Of the servants who went to bed in full health and were found in the morning, burnt to ash. Mere stories to frighten wayward children and excite young girls, you may say. You would not be entirely wrong. Harrenhal is a prize. A nigh impregnable castle with enough land and enough income to make a man, at a stroke, one of the greatest lords in Westeros. But you would not be entirely right either. Say by a king's grace, Harrenhal became yours. Now you must garrison it. You must repair it and maintain it. Even stretched to the ends of your means, you cannot fill and manage the whole castle. So you retreat your household to 4 of the 5 towers, then 3, then 2, then only the bottom thirds of those. You close the hall of 100 hearths and take your meals in your rooms. Even then you can't shake the feeling of desolation, that Harrenhal and its vastness is devouring you. In later years, as you bury a grandson or a great-grandson, the last of your line, you will know it has.
Nobody knows why the Targaryens first came to the island of Dragonstone, Old Valyria was then at the height of its power and the center of the civilized world, which ended at the Narrow Sea. Westeros was a filthy backwater with 7 kings squabbling over borders and minor glories. So much for progress. The island itself was and is nothing. It had no gold or gems to lure Valyrian nobility. All it has is rock. Mostly a shiny black stone, too brittle for war and too sharp for building. The Targaryens called it dragonglass. I call it useless. But the Targaryens managed to raise a castle here. Simpletons claim they used ancient Valyrian sorcery, forgetting that the Targaryens brought a small army with them from Essos. There's no magic in strong backs, though admittedly the castle is unlike any in Westeros. Foreign and strange. If the Targaryens ever regretted their barren outpost and longed for the comforts of home, the doom made their folly permanent. Valyria collapsed into the waves and was no more. To look east was to see the ruin of their homeland, the greatest civilization before or since. But to look west, as Aegon realized, was to see a fertile land ripe for conquest. Perhaps even a new Valyria. Though good for little else, Dragonstone was the perfect staging point for Aegon's invasion of Westeros. The Blackwater Bay granted easy access to the continent. The lands there were disputed by 3 kingdoms: the Reach, the Iron Islands, and the Stormlands. But their capitals were far enough away that none could mount a force before Aegon got a foothold, even if their kings had been able to stop bickering over whose problem he was. Then it was too late. Aegon had chosen his first camp well, with the bay to the east, the river to the south, and open fields to the north and west. His army would be impossible to take by surprise. A perfect site for an invasion, and one day, his capital city, King's Landing. The Doom had taught the Targaryens the prudence of refuge. After the conquest, Dragonstone became the seat of the crown prince and heir to the Iron Throne. It would serve them well, and me ill, 300 years later, after my brother Robert Baratheon rebelled against the Iron Throne and the Lannisters slaughtered the Mad King Aerys and his royal family. Robert dispatched me to deal with the last surviving Targaryen children, but before I arrived, a loyal knight smuggled them across the Narrow Sea to safety. Hatred for the Targaryens blinded Robert. Unjustly, I was blamed, and stripped of our family's castle of Storm's End, and given Dragonstone in its stead. Over the years, whenever I demanded my rights restored, Robert would remind me of the island's royal pedigree and pretend he was doing me honor, as if I were one of his tavern girls to be so easily deceived and dismissed. But Robert is dead, and I, Stannis Baratheon, am the rightful king of Westeros. Let the usurpers and traitors sit on the Iron Throne. From Dragonstone, I will be the dagger at their throat.
Valyria was not the first to conquer the world. In the dawn of days, the city of Geese opened its gates and poured forth its legions across the continent of Essos. With their lockstep discipline and absolute obedience, they ground entire nations beneath their boots and planted the Harpy in every corner of the known world. What they didn't destroy, they chained. Slavery is as old as man, but until the Giscari, it was never an art. The slave lords grew rich and fat as pyramids were raised around them, pleasure houses were filled, and fighting pits were opened. Nobody remembers if the waters around Geese had names before the Empire, but ever since, we know them only as Slaver's Bay and the Gulf of Grief. Of Geese, however, nothing remains but ruins, where end all great civilizations. 5,000 years ago, Valyrian shepherds stumbled on strange eggs, and within a few generations, an upstart Valyrian freehold rose across the sea. 5 times did the Giscari contend with Valyria, and 5 times did they go down in defeat. For the freehold had dragons, and the Empire had none. The best of their legions burned, the others broke. The brick walls of Ys were pulled down, the streets and buildings turned to ash, and the very fields sown with salt, sulfur, and skulls. Yet the Empire was not wholly destroyed. Astapor, Yunkai, and Meereen, once lowly colonies along Slavers Bay, survived, and even thrived. Valyria had watched the Giscari grow rich and powerful off the backs of conquered peoples, and now the self-styled freehold wanted its turn. While the Dragon Lords brought the world to heel, the slave markets of their former enemy never lacked for flesh. Lamenting the lost empire, the descendants of old Ys grew rich and fat. The doom fell on Valyria, and the Dothraki rose to pillage most of the continent at will. But gold-laden Astapor, Yunkai, and Meereen continue as they have for thousands of years, untouched. For even the Horse Lords understand what the Giscari taught Valyria so long ago. What good are slaves without slavers?
Brandon the Builder, founder of House Stark, raised Winterfell with giants over 8,000 years ago. Or so nursemaids tell all the children of the North. The children nod, wide-eyed, unaware of the lesson forced on them, that if even giants obeyed a Stark, so too should they. But like every other castle, Winterfell was built in pieces over thousands of years. The first men settled there because of the hot springs that bubbled through the ground. The water and the heat helped them survive the northern winters, and they built defenses to keep it for themselves. Nobody raised the castle all at once. Probably nobody meant to raise a castle at all. In those days, the Starks were not the greatest house in the north, and Winterfell was not the greatest castle. Barrowton was the oldest, dating to the first king, and the Starks fought the Barrow kings for 1,000 years. Greywater Watch was, like the Crannog men themselves, the strangest. Only marriage subdued its marsh kings. But the greatest rival to Winterfell was always the Dreadfort, and my ancestors, the Red Kings of House Bolton. If tales can be believed, we fought from the long night until the Andals came. Because of us, Winterfell raised its first walls. When we took and burnt the castle anyway, Winterfell built more keeps, more walls, more guard towers. They expanded the granaries and larders to survive our sieges. They tended the godswood to win favor with the old gods against us. As the castle grew, more farmers and villagers flocked every winter from across the north to huddle under its walls, raising the winter town. In the spring, these villagers would find themselves marching in the Stark armies to fight against us. The greatness of Winterfell is as much our doing as the Starks. But in the end, neither its stone walls nor its tall keeps and iron gates could save Winterfell. At its height, it could have lasted a year under heavy siege. But a handful of Ironborn seized it in the night, while its lord, the king in the north, was playing in the south. My dagger ended his reign, and now House Bolton holds the castle of our ancient enemies. The direwolf no longer flies from the battlements above me, nor guards the doors and cornices of Winterfell against me. Below me, miles of long-dead Starks fade into darkness and obscurity, until even their faces are lost. Some Northerners whisper that they wait for the day their house will rise again. They will wait forever.
Most cities are built on stone. Braavos was built on ships, or more specifically, their cargo. Slaves who rose up against their Valyrian captors and seized the helms of the convoy. Of all crimes, Valyria punished rebellion most severely. The slaves faced not execution, but the Valyrian mines or labor camps in the most remote and savage colonies if recaptured. And few corners of the world can long remain hidden from Dragonback. However, our histories claim that a group of slave women prophesied the slaves would find shelter in a distant lagoon behind a wall of pine-clad hills and sea stones, where the frequent fogs would help hide the refugees from the eyes of dragon riders passing overhead. And so it proved. Because they had risked their lives in the name of freedom, The mothers and fathers of the new city vowed that no man, woman, or child in Braavos should ever be a slave. This is the first law of Braavos, engraved in stone on the arch that spans the long canal. For over 100 years, Braavos hid itself from the eyes of the world, who called it the Secret City. Using a dye derived from a local snail, our captains stained their sails purple to hide their stolen Valyrian ships. Our merchants carried false charts and lied when questioned about their home port. Eventually, one Sea Lord, our elected ruler, decided enough time had passed and initiated the unmasking of Braavos to the world and to Valyria. Of course, it helped that the Iron Bank made handsome restitution to the Dragon Lords for the stolen ships, whilst of course refusing to pay for the value of the slaves themselves. The anniversary of the unmasking is celebrated every year in Braavos with 10 days of feasting and masked revelry, a festival like none other in the known world, culminating at midnight on the 10th day when the Titan roars and tens of thousands of celebrants remove their masks as one. Freed of the constraints of secrecy, Braavos quickly grew into the wealthiest and most powerful of the free cities, and, one could argue, the most beautiful. From the sprawling Sea Lord's palace with its menagerie of strange beasts and birds, to the imposing Palace of Justice and the aqueduct we call the Sweetwater River that bears fresh water from the mainland, Braavos is without rival in either engineering or elegance. The temples of Braavos are also famed throughout the world and wondrous to behold. Descended from 100 different peoples, the Braavosi honor 100 different gods. The Temple of the Moon Singers is the foremost of these, being the faith of the slave women whose prophecies led our ancestors here. The Lord of Light has a great temple as well, for his worshippers have grown ever more numerous in the past 100 years. Yet less numerous, and even some forgotten faiths still have temples deep in the heart of the city, on the Isle of the Gods. But the beauty of Braavos is not only in her buildings. Braavosi swordsmanship is renowned throughout the world. Our Braavos eschew the armor and long swords of the Westerosi knights, preferring speed, agility, and slender blades. The greatest Braavos call themselves water dancers, after the custom of dueling upon the moon pool near the Sea Lord's palace. By tradition, the greatest of all the Braavos is the First Sword, who commands the personal guard of the Sea Lord and protects his person at all public events. Once chosen, Sea Lords serve for life. Inevitably, there are always those who wish to cut that life short to effect some change in policy. Though not even the First Swords are the true guardians of Braavos. That honor goes to the Titan, who protects the entrance to the harbor. With his proud head and fiery eyes looming close to 400 feet above the sea, the Titan is a fortress of a kind never seen before or since. His eyes are huge beacon fires, lighting the way for returning ships into the lagoon. Within his bronze body are halls and chambers, murder holes and arrow slits. Enemy ships can be steered onto the rocks by the watchmen inside the Titan, and stones and pots of burning pitch can be dropped onto the decks of any that attempt to pass between the Titan's legs without leave. This has seldom been necessary, however. Not since the Century of Blood has any enemy been so rash as to attempt to provoke the Titan's wrath. Should an enemy break through into the lagoon, however, he would face the walls of Braavos, again not of stone like other cities, but of ships. The arsenal of Braavos can build one of our famous purple-hulled war galleys in a single day. All the vessels are constructed following the same design, so that all the many parts can be prepared in advance, and skilled shipbuilders work upon different sections of the vessel simultaneously to hasten the labor. To organize such a feat of engineering is unprecedented. One need only look at the raucous, confused construction in the shipyards around the world to see the truth of this. Let us imagine that even the arsenal, great as it is, failed us. An enemy who could defeat both the Titan and our fleet would be strong indeed. But Braavos does not depend only on statues and ships. We also have iron and gold.
Valyria was young, and as the young do, it sought to spread its seed. Its first daughter was Volantis, an outpost on the mighty Rhone River at the frontier of the Empire. There, the Dragon Lords raised the famous Black Walls, seamless fused Dragonstone 200 feet tall, and so thick that 6 four-horse chariots can race along the battlements side by side, as they do each year to celebrate the founding of the city. To this day, only those who can trace their ancestry back to old Valyria are allowed to dwell within the Black Walls. None are even permitted to set foot inside without an express invitation of a scion of the old blood, meaning, of course, the ancient and noble blood of foot soldiers. For the city's first 100 years, its only inhabitants were its garrison. But where soldiers go, vice follows. Taverns and brothels began to sprout up outside the Black Walls, and merchant ships began to call as well, bearing the favored trade of the summer sea, slaves. The East Bank filled with homes, shops, and society, and so the taverns and brothels moved to the West Bank, where foreigners, sellswords, and pirates erected their own shadow city of fornication, drunkenness, and murder. In time, the West Bank became such a cesspit of crime and depravity that the Volantines had no choice but to send their slave soldiers across the Rhone to restore order and some semblance of decency. Like all such missions, they succeeded, they left, then they failed. When the Volantines grew weary of shipping their soldiers across the Rhone every year, they built the famous Long Bridge of Volantis, strong enough to support the weight of 1,000 elephants and many more soldiers. The Long Bridge of Volantis stands today as the longest bridge in all the known world. The Volantine rulers intended the bridge to spread the civilization of the East Bank to the west. Instead, the depravity of the West Bank spread east. Shops, temples, taverns, inns, and brothels line the bridge, most 3 or 4 stories tall, with each floor overhanging the one beneath it. One can buy anything on the Long Bridge, or steal it, if one's hands are quick enough. But if they're not... Though at least half the decor committed no greater crime than displeasing a master, for in Volantis there are 5 slaves for every free man, a proportion matched only by the cities of Slavers Bay. The Volantine masters mark their property with facial tattoos, permanent and scarring, which denote the vocation of the slave. Slave soldiers wear green tiger stripes upon their faces. Slave whores are marked by tears beneath one eye. The slaves that collect the dung of horses and elephants are marked with flies. The drivers of the hathays, the carts pulled by the small elephants of Volantis, are marked with wheels, and so on. A master may give his slave freedom, but no man can give a new face. Is it any wonder, then, that the slaves and freed men have turned in such great numbers to the priests who preach of a cleansing fire? The Temple of the Lord of Light in Volantis is said to be the greatest in all the world, larger even than the great sept of Baelor. All who serve within this mighty temple are slaves, bought as children and trained to become priests, temple prostitutes, or warriors. And one could argue its adherents outside the temple are slaves as well, in mind if not in body. Magic frees nobody, except its practitioner, to do what he will with those who can't, just as the Black Walls free the old blood to see what they will, without those they don't. But one must wonder how much longer such freedoms will endure, when across Essos one hears the sound of chains breaking, of slaves rising, of dragons roaring. Volantis may call itself the first daughter of Valyria, but it is not the last.
Qarth has always and only belonged to the Qarthine. We were never part of Valyria's empire, nor have we ever fallen to a Dothraki horde. Our walls and the red waste outside them guard us from such annoyance. Many call the approach to our city the Garden of Bones. It needs little tending to grow. Our city, however, would be quite a prize for any empire. Qarth straddles 2 worlds, a greedy and curious west and a rich and mysterious east. The marvels of Yeti and Ashai pass through our markets and share berths with the riches of the free cities and Westeros. Our ports have fulfilled many a trader's dreams, almost as many as they have broken. We call Qarth the greatest city that ever was or will be. An easy claim to make if one knows only the docks and customs houses of other cities. An easy lie to swallow if a people see only the gold and jewels of their rulers, which we, the 13 who govern the city, are careful to ensure. The proud Qartheen shook off the yoke of unjust kings long ago, so they are told at festivals by the pureborn, the king's direct descendants who have controlled the 13 ever since. Only now, instead of scepters, they use ships. A merchant only remains on the 13 until the others are no longer afraid to deny him, or too afraid to deny his replacement. Except for the warlocks, they alone hold a hereditary seat, a relic from when they had powers, or at least from when the world was younger and more easily duped. Over the years, we have developed an understanding with them. They shall always be welcome on our councils and at affairs of state, provided they never come. Rare is the civic problem that can be solved by cryptic nonsense and shade of the evening. Thankfully, they need little encouragement to confine themselves to their House of the Undying. Yet perhaps we Qartheen are too confined ourselves. We feel safe behind our walls and our laws, which no visitor can hope to follow, and by which any citizen who vouches for a guest always pays with his life. But like a ship in the summer seas, a city grows becalmed without fresh wind. The greatest city that ever was or will be? An epitaph. I would prefer the greatest city that is.
The great masters of Meereen, as if calling themselves such could make them so. Thousands of years ago, during the height of the Giscari Empire, Meereen was second only to Old Geese in wealth and glory. A paradise by the sea, if one didn't mind the constant clinking of chains and cracking whips. Slaves built Meereen, and on their backs the city rested like a litter. Then came the dragons of Valyria. The masters of Old Geese would not bow, so they burned. The Valyrians tore down their walls, burned their pyramids to ash, and sowed their fields with salt and skulls. An old slave woman once told me that the Valyrians intended to break the chains of the Giscari slaves, absorbing them into the Valyrian freehold where every man held a vote. But the great masters of Meereen received their new overlords in the great temple, plying them with gold, wine, and all the wealth that slavery had brought them, and the Valyrians instead took up the whip themselves. I do not believe it. As their empire expanded, the Valyrians needed more and more bodies to feed their mines and colonies, when no wage could ever tempt a free man. The great masters merely accommodated their new customers, staying rich as the Giscari Empire crumbled. After the doom fell on Valyria, the great masters worried for their fortunes. By this time, the Valyrians were their greatest providers and purchasers of slaves. Then the Dothraki horse lords swept out of the plains of Essos, and proved to be as fond of slaving as the dragon lords before them. The great masters grew richer still. For the first time in its history, the great masters alone ruled Meereen, and chaos ruled the rest of the world. The fighting pits swallowed men who in previous centuries would have filled the ranks of the Valyrian armies. Without these soldiers to maintain order, the wealthy had to buy their own, which the good masters of Astapor were more than willing to sell. If the buyer's nerves still needed calming, the wise masters of Yunkai could sell him further release. The great masters, the good masters, the wise masters. Yet none was so great, good, or wise that they recognized our queen for what she was. Her ancestors had destroyed them, then become them. Perhaps they assumed she would bend as easily. But our queen does not bend. She breaks.
Westeros has mighty rivers, but none of them compare to the Rhone. It is said that there is no stream or puddle in western Essos but drains to Mother Rhone. No doubt an exaggeration. Until one sees the river, at its widest, a man in the center can't see a shore to either side. The greatest of Mother Rhoyne's children were the Rhoynar, a civilization as ancient and grand as old Guise. Fishers, traders, scholars, workers of wood, stone and metal. The Rhoynar raised their elegant cities from the headwaters of the Rhone down to her mouth, each lovelier than the last. For many centuries, the Rhoynar lived in relative peace. When invaders swept down from the hills, the Rhoynar, women and men, would don silver-scaled armor, fish-head helms, tall spears, and turtle-shell shields. If the enemy did not laugh themselves away, it was said that Mother Rhoyne would whisper the enemy's secrets to her children, and the Rhoynish wizards could raise watery walls to drown their foes. Whatever magic the Rhoynar may have had, it wasn't enough. When Valyrian colonists first arrived, the Rhoynar embraced them, for all men were welcome to share the bounty of Mother Rhoyne. Perhaps a water people should have been more cautious of strangers who exalted fire and blood. Legend has it that one day the Valyrians netted and butchered one of the giant turtles the Rhoynar held sacred. As a result, thousands were killed or enslaved, cities and towns were burned, drowned, and rebuilt. In these wars, the Valyrians emerged as victorious more often than not. The princes of the Rhoynish cities, fiercely proud of their independence, fought alone, whilst the Valyrian colonies aided one another. Eventually, the Rhoynish princes ceased their squabbling and united behind Prince Garin, who led the largest army Essos had ever seen, against 100,000 Valyrian colonists, 100 war elephants, and 3 dragon lords. Thousands burned, but thousands more sheltered in the shallows of the river, whilst the Rhoynish wizards raised enormous water spouts against the foe's dragons. Rhoynish archers brought down 2 of the dragons, whilst the 3rd fled, wounded. And thereafter, the Rhoynar named Garin the Great. But Mother Valyria proved just as caring as Mother Rhoyne. When Garin the Great marched his army against Volantis, 300 Valyrian dragons descended from the sky. Tens of thousands burned whilst others rushed into the river, but the fires burned so hot that the water boiled and turned to steam. Garin the Great was captured alive and made to watch as Valyrians butchered every last man, so many that their blood turned the great harbor of Volantis red as far as the eye could see. Then they forced Garin to watch as they marched on his own city and enslaved all the women and children his army had left behind. The singers claim that Prince Garin called out Mother Rhoyne to curse the Valyrians, and she in turn flooded the city with foul waters and a damp fog that caused the skin of the Valyrians to harden and crack, and thus was born Grayscale. Fearing a similar fate, another Rhoynish ruler, Princess Nymeria, led her own people into every ship, skiff, and raft they had, and fled Essos. Eventually, after much hardship, they landed in sun-swept and bone-dry Dawn. But we all know that tale. Now Valyria has followed the Rhoynar out of this world, and her daughters have grown into free cities, wealthy and powerful and proud. Still, Mother Rhoyne flows on, past ancient ruins and bustling harbors, sweeping all man's kingdoms to the sea.